The dust hung in the air like a question nobody wanted to answer. Cade Harlow rode into Bitter Springs with no intention of staying longer than it took to water his horse and buy tobacco. The town looked like every other sun-bleached settlement he'd passed through in the last 6 months, wooden storefronts leaning slightly, dirt streets rutted from wagon wheels, and a population that watched strangers the way vultures watched dying cattle. He tied his mare to the post outside the general store and stepped onto the boardwalk. The boards creaked under his weight. Inside, a bell chimed as the door swung shut behind him. The man behind the counter was thin, with a mustache that drooped past his jaw. He looked up from a ledger, nodded once, and said nothing. Cade liked him already. "Tobacco," Cade said, "and any bread you got that isn't older than me." The man reached beneath the counter without a word, producing a small tin and a cloth-wrapped loaf. Cade set coins on the counter and was about to leave when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A sharp crack, like wood against bone. Then a voice, small, breaking. "I took it off, please." Cade froze. The shopkeeper's eyes flicked toward the back window, then returned to his ledger. His jaw tightened. He said nothing. Another crack, louder this time. Cade turned toward the window. Through the glass, he could see into the alley behind the store, a narrow strip of dirt between buildings where trash collected and shadows pooled thick even in midday sun. A girl knelt in the dirt. She couldn't have been more than 17, maybe 18. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough cord, and her dress, simple gray, frayed at the hem, was torn at the shoulder. Her hair fell in tangled dark waves across her face, but Cade could see her trembling. Standing over her was a man in black, a preacher, from the look of his coat and the wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. In his hand was a leather strap, thick and stiff, the kind used for mending harnesses. He raised it again. "You were told," the preacher said, his voice low and cold, "what would happen if you disobeyed." "I didn't mean to," the girl gasped, her voice cracking. I couldn't breathe." The strap came down across her shoulders. She cried out, her body folding forward. Cade's hand moved to his hip before he even thought about it. His fingers brushed the grip of his revolver. Behind him, the shopkeeper spoke quietly, "Don't." Cade didn't turn. "What's happening out there?" "Punishment." "For what?" "Breaking a rule." "What rule?" The shopkeeper hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, like a man stepping around broken glass. "That's Reverend Kane. The girl's his ward. She's bound to him by church law." Cade finally looked back at the man. Church law. His church, his law. The shopkeeper's eyes were hollow. "He took her in when her family died. Fever 3 years back. He says he saved her soul, says she owes him obedience. And the town doesn't interfere." Cade turned back to the window. The preacher had crouched down now, his face close to the girl's. She was crying, her shoulders shaking. He gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You will wear it," he said, "until I say otherwise. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. The preacher released her and stood. From his coat, he pulled something small, metal, shaped like a crescent. Cade couldn't see it clearly, but he saw the girl flinch when the preacher moved toward her neck. "I took it off, please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible through the glass. The preacher fastened whatever it was around her throat. A collar, Cade realized, iron from the dull glint of it. The girl's hands went to it instinctively, her fingers trembling against the metal. "Stand," the preacher commanded. She stood unsteady, her legs shaking beneath her. The preacher walked away without another word, his boots crunching in the gravel. He disappeared around the corner, leaving the girl alone in the alley. She sank back to her knees, her hands still at her throat, and sobbed. Cade stood at the window for a long moment. His chest felt tight, like something inside him had been wound too hard and was about to snap. He looked back at the shopkeeper. "Where's the sheriff?" The man shook his head slowly. Wouldn't matter if we had one. Why? Kane owns half this town. The other half's too scared to say otherwise. Cade's jaw tightened. He picked up the tobacco and bread from the counter, then walked to the door. "Mister," the shopkeeper called after him, "whatever you're thinking, don't. Men who cross him don't stay long in Bitter Springs." Cade pushed the door open and stepped into the sunlight. The alley was easy to find. He walked along the side of the general store until he reached the narrow gap between buildings. The girl was still there, kneeling in the dirt. She didn't look up when his shadow fell. Cross her. Cade crouched down, keeping his distance so he wouldn't startle her. "You hurt?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. Her hands stayed at her throat, fingers pressed against the iron collar. It was crude. He saw now 2 pieces of metal bent into a half circle, fastened together with a small lock at the front. Not tight enough to choke her, but close. Close enough that she'd feel it with every breath. "Can you stand?" he tried again. Still nothing. He stayed where he was, watching her. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. Her dress was streaked with dirt and sweat, and the skin on her shoulders, where the strap had hit, was red and raw. Finally she spoke. Her voice was small, broken. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you." She looked up then, just for a moment. Her eyes were dark, red-rimmed from crying. There was fear in them, but something else too, something harder. "He'll see you," she whispered. "He'll know." "Know what?" "That someone talked to me." Cade frowned. "He keeps you from talking." "He keeps me from everything." Her voice cracked again, and she looked away. "Please, just go." Cade studied her face, the way her fingers kept pressing against the collar, like she was trying to push it away but couldn't. His chest tightened again, that same winding feeling. He stood slowly. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then barely a whisper, "Eliza." "I'm Cade." She didn't respond. He turned and walked back toward the street, his boots crunching in the gravel. But when he reached the corner, he stopped. He looked back at her, still kneeling in the dirt, her hands at her throat. And something in him broke. He didn't know why. He'd seen cruelty before, plenty of it. The world was full of men like Reverend Cain, men who twisted faith and power into weapons. Cade had learned long ago not to get involved, to keep moving, to survive. But standing there, watching her, he couldn't move. He thought of the sound of the strap, the way her voice had cracked when she begged. "I took it off, please." He turned back toward the street and walked to his horse. The town was quiet. A few people moved along the boardwalks, but none of them looked at him. None of them looked toward the alley. Cade untied his mare and stood there for a moment, one hand on the reins. Then he glanced back at the alley one more time and made a decision. Cade didn't leave town. He found a boarding house at the edge of Bitter Springs, a sagging 2-story structure with peeling paint and a landlady who asked no questions. He paid for 3 nights, though he didn't know yet if he'd stay that long. That evening he sat on the porch of the boarding house, smoking a cigarette and watching the street. The sun sank low, painting the buildings in shades of amber and rust. A few people passed by, men in worn hats, women with baskets, a child chasing a hoop with a stick. None of them looked happy. Cade thought about Eliza, about the collar around her neck, about the way she'd flinched when the preacher touched her. He didn't know what he planned to do. He only knew he couldn't leave yet. The next morning, he went back to the general store. The same shopkeeper stood behind the counter. He looked up when Cade entered, and something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or wariness. "Morning," Cade said. The man nodded. "Need something else?" "Information." The shopkeeper's expression didn't change, but his hands stilled on the counter. "About what?" "The girl, Eliza." The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, low and tired. "You're still here." "I am." "You shouldn't be." "So I've been told." Cade leaned against the counter. "Where does she live?" The shopkeeper shook his head. "You don't want to go there." I didn't ask if I wanted to, I asked where. The man studied him, weighing something. Finally, he spoke. The church, back of the property. There's a small house, more like a shed, really. That's where he keeps her. Keeps her. She's not allowed to leave unless he permits it. Says it's for her own protection. Says the world's too dangerous for a girl without guidance. The shopkeeper's mouth twisted, just slightly. Truth is, he likes the control. Cade's jaw tightened, and nobody stops him. Who's going to stop him? He's got the fear of God in half the town, and the other half thinks she deserves it. Deserves what? The shopkeeper hesitated again. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. She tried to run, about a year ago, got as far as the edge of town before he found her, brought her back, and well, that's when the collar started. Cade felt something cold settle in his chest. How long she had to wear it. On and off, depends on his mood, sometimes a day, sometimes a week. The man paused. This time she took it off herself. He'd left it unlocked by mistake, and she, I don't know, maybe she just needed to breathe. And he punished her for it. He always does. Cade looked toward the window, toward the alley WH. Ere he'd first seen her, the space was empty now, just dirt and shadow. What's her crime? Cade asked. What's she done to deserve this? The shopkeeper shrugged, but there was bitterness in the gesture. Being alone, being young, being his. Cade was quiet for a moment, then he straightened. Where's the church? North end of town, can't miss it, only building with a steeple. The shopkeeper leaned forward slightly. But listen to me, mister. Cain's not just a preacher, he's got men, loyal men. You go poking around, you'll find trouble. I've found worse. The man studied him again, then shook his head slowly. You got a death wish. Not particularly. Then why? Cade didn't answer right away. He thought about the question, about why he was still here, why he cared. He didn't have a good answer. He only knew that when he'd seen her kneeling in the dirt, something inside him had refused to let it go. She asked him to stop, Cade said finally, and he didn't. The shopkeeper's expression softened just a little. He nodded slowly. Her name's Eliza Farrow. Her family used to have a homestead about 10 miles east. Good people. When the fever came through, it took both her parents and her brother. She was the only one left. Cain took her in, said it was Christian charity. He paused. Maybe it started that way, but it didn't stay that way. Cade absorbed this quietly. She got anyone else, any family? None that I know of. Friends. The shopkeeper shook his head. Cain doesn't let her talk to folks, says it's improper, says she needs to focus on repentance. Repentance for what? Existing, I guess. Cade pushed off the counter and headed for the door. Mister, the shopkeeper called after him, you go to that church, you better be ready for what comes next. Cade paused at the threshold, his hand on the door frame. I usually am. He walked north through town, following the dirt road toward the church. It wasn't hard to find. The building rose above the others, its white-painted walls stark against the pale sky. The steeple was crooked, leaning slightly to one side, like the whole structure was tired. Behind the church, just as the shopkeeper had said, was a smaller building. A shed, really, with a single window and a door that looked like it had been patched more than once. Cade approached slowly, keeping his steps quiet. He could hear voices from inside the church, singing, maybe, or prayer. He couldn't tell. He moved around the side of the shed and peered through the window. Eliza sat on a narrow cot, her back to the wall. The collar was still around her neck. Her hands rested in her lap, and she stared at the floor, unmoving. Cade knocked lightly on the door. The singing from the church stopped. Eliza's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide when she saw him through the window. She shook her head quickly, urgently. No, go. But Cade didn't move. The door to the church opened. Footsteps crossed the yard. Cade turned just as Reverend Cain stepped into view. The preacher was taller than Cade had expected, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome once, but had hardened into something cold. His eyes were pale, almost colorless in the sunlight. "Can I help you?" Kane's voice was calm, measured, but there was steel underneath. Cade met his gaze, just passing through. "Then pass." Cade nodded slowly. He glanced once more at the window, at Eliza, who sat frozen on the cot. Then he turned and walked away. But as he did, he heard Kane's voice behind him, quiet and sharp. "If I see you near her again, we'll have a different conversation." Cade didn't look back, but his hand stayed close to his revolver all the way back to the boarding house. Cade spent the rest of the day watching. He sat on the boarding house porch, smoking and keeping his eyes on the road. Bitter Springs was small enough that any movement stood out. He saw the preacher twice, once heading into the general store, once walking toward the saloon with two other men. Both times, Cade noted the way people stepped aside, the way they nodded but didn't meet his eyes. Fear, Cade knew, had a smell. This town reeked of it. By nightfall, the streets had emptied. Cade waited until the lamps in the windows went dark, until the only sound was the wind moving through the eaves. Then he stood, buckled his gun belt, and walked back toward the church. The moon was thin, barely a sliver, and the shadows were deep. Cade moved quietly, keeping to the edges of the buildings. When he reached the church, he circled around to the back, to the shed where Eliza was kept. The window was dark. He approached the door and tested the handle, locked. He crouched down, studying the lock. It was simple, old. He pulled a thin piece of wire from his pocket, something he'd carried since his younger, less lawful days, and worked it into the mechanism. It took less than a minute. The lock clicked open. Cade pushed the door inward, slow and careful. It creaked just once and he froze. Inside, the room was small and dim. A single cot, a wooden chair, a bucket in the corner. The air smelled like dust and sweat and something else, something sour, like fear left to sit too long. Eliza sat on the cot, her eyes wide in the darkness. "It's me," Cade whispered. "Cade." She didn't move. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I'm not here to hurt you." "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "If he finds you." "He won't. He always finds out." Cade moved closer, crouching down so he was at her level. "How long have you been wearing that collar?" She looked away, her hands going instinctively to her throat. 3 days. "And before?" "I don't know, weeks maybe." "Eliza," Cade kept his voice low, steady, "I can get that off you." She shook her head quickly. "He has the key, he keeps it with him." "Then I'll break it." Her eyes snapped back to his. "You can't. If you do, he'll—" She stopped, her breath catching. He'll know someone helped me. And he'll kill you." Cade held her gaze. "Let me worry about that." She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then slowly she shook her head. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's wrong. Lots of things are wrong. Doesn't mean I have to walk past them." Eliza's jaw tightened. She looked down at her hands. "If you break it, if I run, he'll find me. He always does. And next time," her voice broke, "next time it won't just be a collar." Cade stayed quiet, letting her words settle. "Then don't run," he said finally. "Not yet." "What?" "I need to know something first." He glanced toward the door, then back at her. "Does he have other people, men who work for him?" She nodded. 3, maybe 4, they do whatever he asks." "Where are they?" "Around town. They watch, they listen. If anyone speaks against him, they report it." Cade absorbed this, and the town just lets it happen. "The town's afraid." Eliza's voice was barely audible. He says God speaks through him, that anyone who defies him defies God." "And you believe that?" She looked at him, and for the first time, Cade saw something other than fear in her eyes. Anger, small but there. "No," she whispered, "I don't." Cade nodded slowly. "Good." He stood and moved toward the door, listening. The night was quiet. No footsteps, no voices. Stay here, he said. I'll come back. When? Tomorrow night, maybe the night after. He looked back at her. But when I do, be ready. For what? To leave. Eliza's breath hitched. You don't understand. He won't let me go, he'll. I know, Cade's voice was calm, but there was something hard underneath. And he'll try to stop me, but I'm not asking his permission. He opened the door and slipped out into the night. The next day, Cade returned to the general store. The shopkeeper looked up when he entered, and his expression shifted, concern, maybe, or resignation. You're still here, the man said. I am. You went to see her. I did. The shopkeeper shook his head slowly. You're going to get yourself killed. Maybe, Cade leaned against the counter. But before I do, I need to know something. How many men does Cain have? The shopkeeper hesitated. 4, maybe 5, depends on the day. Names. Why? Because I need to know who I'm dealing with. The man sighed, then pulled a pencil and a scrap of paper from beneath the counter. He wrote 4 names, then slid the paper across. These are the ones I know about. They're loyal, mean, don't expect mercy from any of them. Cade studied the names, committing them to memory. Then he folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. Appreciate it. One more thing, the shopkeeper said quietly. Cain's got a gun. Don't let the preacher act fool you. He's faster than he looks. Cade nodded, noted. He left the store and walked back toward the boarding house. But as he turned the corner, he saw them, 2 men standing near his horse, inspecting the saddle. One of them looked up as Cade approached. He was broad, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. The other was thinner, wiry, with eyes that moved too quickly. This your horse? The scarred one asked. It is. Fancy saddle. Gets the job done. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Reverend Cain wanted us to pass along a message. I'm listening. Leave town tonight. Cade studied them both, his expression calm. And if I don't? The scarred man's smile faded. Then we'll make you. Cade held his gaze for a long moment. Then he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. You can try. The wiry one's hand moved toward his belt. Cade's hand moved faster. The revolver cleared leather before either of them could react. Cade didn't aim it at them, just held it low, steady, so they could see it. Walk away, Cade said quietly. The scarred man's jaw tightened, but after a moment he nodded. Your funeral. They turned and walked down the street. Their boots crunching in the dirt. Cade holstered his gun and stood there for a moment, his heart steady, his hands still. Then he looked toward the church, toward the shed where Eliza waited. And he made his plan. Cade waited until the next evening before returning to the shed. This time he brought supplies, a canteen of water, some bread, and a thin blanket he'd bought from the general store. He moved through the darkness like a shadow, slipping past the church and around to the back. The door was still unlocked. He'd left it that way. Inside, Eliza sat on the cot, her knees drawn up to her chest. The collar gleamed dully in the faint moonlight coming through the window. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression shifted, surprise, maybe, or relief. You came back, she whispered. Said I would. He set the supplies down on the chair and crouched in front of her. How are you? She didn't answer right away. Her hands went to the collar, fingers tracing the edge of the iron. He came by earlier, asked if anyone had been here. Cade's jaw tightened. What did you say? I said no. She looked at him, her eyes dark and serious, but he didn't believe me. Why not? Because he never believes me. Her voice was quiet, but there was a tremor underneath. He said if I lied, he'd know. He always knows. Cade studied her face, the way fear and exhaustion had carved lines into her young features. She looked older than she should have, harder. Eliza, he said gently, I need you to trust me. I don't know you. I know. And even if I did, she trailed off, her breath catching. Even if you get me out of here, where would I go? I've got no family, no money, no. You'll figure it out. Cade's voice was calm, steady, but first, we get you out. She shook her head. You don't understand. He won't let me go. He'll hunt me, he'll. Then let him. Cade met her gaze. But you won't be alone. Eliza stared at him, her breath shallow. Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything. No, Cade agreed. I don't. Then why? He was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. Finally, he said, because someone should have done it a long time ago. Her eyes glistened, and she looked away quickly, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. Cade reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal tool, a file, thin and sharp. This might hurt a little, he said, but I can get that collar off, tonight. Eliza's eyes widened. He'll know. I don't care. But, Eliza, Cade's voice was firm but not unkind. You've been wearing this for 3 days. How much longer do you want to wear it? She didn't answer, but slowly her hands moved away from her throat. Cade leaned closer, examining the lock. It was crude, held together by a single pin. He wedged the file into the gap and began working it back and forth, slowly, carefully. Eliza sat perfectly still, her breathing shallow. Tell me about your family, Cade said quietly, trying to distract her. She hesitated. What do you want to know? Anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, my father was a carpenter. He built our house himself. It was small, but it was warm. My mother used to sing while she cooked. And my brother, her voice cracked. He was only 12 when the fever took him. Cade kept working the lock, his movements steady. What was his name? Daniel. And your parents? Thomas and Clara. She paused. They're buried on the homestead. Cain wouldn't let me visit them, said it was too dangerous, said I needed to stay here where he could protect me. Cade's jaw tightened, but he didn't stop. You'll see them again when this is over. How? We'll ride out there. I'll take you. Eliza's breath hitched. You do that. I would. The pin slipped free. The collar loosened. Cade pulled it away carefully, setting it on the floor. Eliza's hands went immediately to her throat, her fingers trembling as they touched bare skin. She let out a breath, half sob, half laugh. It's off. It's off, Cade confirmed. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Cade nodded. Don't thank me yet. We still have to get you out of here. When? Tomorrow night. I'll come for you after dark. Be ready. Eliza wiped at her eyes, nodding quickly. I will. Cade stood and moved toward the door, but before he left, he turned back. Eliza, one more thing. What? Don't wear the collar tomorrow, even if he asks, even if he threatens you. Her face paled. He'll. Let him be angry. You've worn it long enough. Cade's voice was quiet but firm. You don't belong in chains. She stared at him, and something in her expression shifted. Fear, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like hope. Cade slipped out into the night. But as he walked back through town, he felt it, the weight of eyes watching him. He turned, scanning the shadows. No one. But the feeling didn't leave. He reached the boarding house and immed the stairs to his room. Inside, he sat on the edge of the bed and cleaned his revolver, checking the chambers, making sure everything was ready. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring trouble. And he intended to meet it head-on. The next evening came heavy with heat and silence. Cade spent the day preparing. He checked his gun, his ammunition, his horse. He walked through town once more, noting where Cain's men gathered, where the preacher himself moved throughout the day. By the time the sun sank low, Cade knew the layout by heart. He waited until full dark before heading to the church. The shed door was ajar when he arrived. Cade's pulse quickened. He pushed it open slowly, his hand on his gun. Inside, Eliza stood near the cot. She wore a different dress, still simple but cleaner. Her hair was pulled back and the collar was gone. But she wasn't alone. Reverend Cain stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his pale eyes fixed on Cade. "I wondered when you'd come," Cain said calmly. Cade didn't move. "Let her go." "No. She doesn't belong to you." Cain's expression didn't change. "She belongs to God, and God entrusted her to me." "You mean you took her, and you broke her?" Cain stepped forward, and Cade saw it then, the gun tucked into his belt. "She needed discipline, guidance. The world is cruel to women like her. I saved her from that." "You made her a prisoner." "I made her safe." Cade's hand tightened on his revolver. "Then why the collar?" Cain's jaw twitched. "She disobeyed. She took off a piece of metal you forced her to wear." Cade's voice was low, dangerous. "That's not disobedience, that's survival." "You don't understand." "I understand plenty." Cade stepped forward. "And I understand this. She's leaving tonight with me." Cain's hand moved toward his gun. Cade drew faster. The shot echoed through the small room, deafening. Cain staggered back, his hand clutching his shoulder. His gun clattered to the floor. Eliza gasped, pressing herself against the wall. Cade moved quickly, kicking Cain's gun away. He crouched down, meeting the preacher's gaze. "If you come after her, I'll find you, and next time I won't aim for your shoulder." Cain's face twisted with pain and fury. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Cade stood, "but she won't." He turned to Eliza, holding out his hand. "Come on." She hesitated, her eyes wide, her breath coming fast. Then slowly she reached out and took his hand. They ran. Behind them, Cade heard Cain shouting, heard footsteps pounding through the church. But by the time the preacher's men reached the street, Cade and Eliza were already at the boarding house, already mounting his horse. Cade pulled Eliza up behind him. "Hold on." She wrapped her arms around his waist, and he kicked the mare into a gallop. They rode hard through the night, leaving Bitter Springs behind. The wind whipped through Eliza's hair, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight lift from her chest. By dawn, they reached the old homestead. The house was still standing, though barely. The roof had caved in on one side, and the windows were broken. But the grave were there, behind the house, marked with simple wooden crosses. Eliza slid off the horse and walked toward them slowly, her steps unsteady. She knelt between the grave, her hands pressed against the earth. Cade stayed back, giving her space. She stayed there for a long time, crying quietly. When she finally stood, her face was streaked with tears, but her expression was calmer. "Thank you," she said quietly. Cade nodded. "Where will you go?" "I don't know." She looked at him. "Where will you go?" He thought about it. "West, probably. Got some work waiting for me in Nevada." "Could I?" She stopped, her voice faltering. "Could I come with you, just until I figure things out?" Cade studied her face, then he nodded. "If you want." "I do." They rode together for the next 3 days, moving steadily west. Cade taught her how to handle a rifle, how to start a fire, how to read the land. She learned quickly, her fear gradually replaced by something steadier, confidence, maybe, or just the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. On the 4th day, they reached a small town called Silver Creek. It was bigger than Bitter Springs, busier, with a hotel and a general store and a sheriff who didn't look like he was in anyone's pocket. Cade found a boarding house for Eliza and paid for 2 weeks. "This'll give you time to find work," he said. "There's a seamstress on Main Street who's looking for help. I already asked." Eliza stared at him. "You're leaving." "I am." "Why?" "Because you don't need me anymore." He smiled faintly. "And because I've got that job waiting in Nevada." She looked down, her hands twisting together. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She looked up, her eyes bright. "You gave me my life back." Cade was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "Then live it loud." She smiled, small but real. "I will." He tipped his hat and turned to leave. Cade, she called after him. He looked back. If you're ever in Silver Creek again, I'll find you, he said. And then he rode west into the open country, the sun warm on his back. Years later, travelers passing through Silver Creek would tell stories about a woman named Eliza Farrow, a seamstress who became a school teacher, who spoke kindly but firmly, who never wore anything around her neck, not even a necklace. And if you asked her how she'd come to Silver Creek, she'd smile and say, "A cowboy brought me here. He saw my punishment and his heart broke, so he set me free." And then she'd get back to work, her hands steady, her voice strong, her life entirely her own.